September is for storytelling. This month we're going to be diving into every step that goes into telling a good story in order to equip you with the basic skills to go out and tell stories. Today we're going to be focusing on why you should be telling stories, what goes into a good story, the structure you should be using, and so much more. Today kicks off our month of giveaways, including the Filmmaking Kit grand prize that one lucky member of the YouTube community is going to win. We're talking everything you need to improve your storytelling game: audio, lighting, and tripod. Plus, there's some sweet swag to step up your fashion game. So what is the gear that we're talking about? The Filmmaking Kit includes a Rode Wireless ME, an Aputure Amaran 60X COB light, as well as the Light Dome Mini SE, Ulanzi CG02 handle grip, and an 80-inch tripod. If you win this contest, you're going to have all the tools you need to add a little bit of extra flair to the stories that you're telling. Is this gear required to tell good stories? Not at all, but gear can help you to overcome limitations of your smartphone's camera. So how do you win? Easy. First, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel for smartphone storytellers, and then like the video and comment the answer to the question that I ask in the video. I'm going to pick one winner from all the entries for the month, and then announce the winner on October 4th. There's another new chance to win every single week, so make sure you check out all 4 videos. Full contest rules are in the description for this video. All right, enough business, on to week 1 of the September is for Storytelling content. So why should you be telling stories in the first place? Simply put, storytelling helps you to connect with your supporters. Now, when I say a supporter, it doesn't have to be someone who's contributing financially. It's someone who's following your organization or the work that you're doing. It doesn't matter if you're an individual telling stories or an organization that's helping others. Stories connect with people on a deeper level than a simple informational video would. Trust me, if I could figure out a better way to deliver these types of videos in more of a storytelling fashion, I would jump at it. It's one thing to tell someone cool things that your organization's doing, but it's another thing when you're able to share a story of how it's actually changed someone's life. There's a reason you always saw those corny testimonies during late night infomercial videos. You know the ones I'm talking about. Some guy is opening his cabinets and then suddenly hundreds of mismatched Tupperware containers are falling on him. But if he had bought the product that's being sold that night, his life would be changed by better organization in his cabinets. The stories that you're telling, though, should have a little more weight to them than those, but it's a similar idea. You're showing people how whatever you're offering has helped change someone's life. It's not intended as a gimmick or to sell someone something, but instead to validate the fact that you're actually offering something that's going to help them in some way. Similarly, if you're an organization telling stories, it gives them a glimpse behind the veil to see what's actually happening in the organization. They get to see how their support's helping to make an impact. You can also be reminded of why you're doing what you're doing in the first place if you take the time to share stories. It can be lonely working in a silo doing whatever work you've been called to. I'm going to be honest, it can be lonely creating content for this channel. My heart is to help people tell better stories using the gear that they already have, but there's a lot of work that happens behind the scenes to make an impact. Earlier this summer though, when I traveled to Brazil to teach storytelling, I was reminded of the impact that this could be having. It was there that I discovered there was a teacher who shows my videos to his classroom every single week, helping them to grasp storytelling on a deeper level. I wasn't able to record a testimonial video with them while I was there, but the story showed me how I could have an impact equipping people in a completely different hemisphere, helping them to tell stories. When you seek out stories and share them, you find fuel to keep doing the work that you're doing. So that's why you need to be telling stories. I dove into this topic a little bit more in depth in my 5 reasons that you should be telling stories video, so check that out if you want a little bit more on the topic. But this leads us to our next question. Where do you find stories to tell in the first place? Many times when you're doing work that's having an impact, you're going to hear stories in your day-to-day business. It could be through a passing comment from someone you've helped, or potentially just through word of mouth for someone else. These stories don't typically come to you in a ready-to-share form, so you might need to do a little bit of legwork to track down the full story. That could be anything from jumping on a phone call to ask questions, to having them write out their story in an email. You may not always realize that there's a story to be told, but the more you tell stories, then the easier it's going to be to find those stories. But what if you've already shared all of the readily available stories? So how do you go about finding new stories? There's a few places you can go to find stories. You could send out a note to those you've helped to see if there's any stories you haven't come across. Often, an organization finds that they hear more of the negative encounters than the positive ones. People are more inclined to share a negative experience with an organization. As a result, you might find that there are more stories of life change that people just didn't think to share. You might not be flooded with responses by asking people to submit them, but there's a good chance you get a few that are worth following up. Additionally, brainstorm other angles you might be able to take with stories. You never want to force a story to be something that it isn't just so it can fit a mold, but I found that many stories have multiple ways that you can share them. Is there a different angle to a story that you've already shared that would help to highlight another way that you've had an impact? Or is there another story that you didn't share in the past that could benefit from being told in a slightly different way than you originally thought? Finally, remember that not every story you share needs to be a giant story. Sometimes sharing a smaller story to highlight a larger event can work really well. Let me give you an example. A few years ago during COVID, I told the story of an organization that was providing food for people who were unable to work because of the pandemic. We shared a story for the sake of thanking people who had supported this outreach. To tell the story, we shared some statistics and details of how the outreach was making a difference. But in the middle of this story, we shared how there was one lady who had shown up to get some food on her birthday. She didn't make a big deal of it, but the organization noticed it was her birthday when they were checking her identification. To celebrate the woman, they brought out a cake and sang happy birthday for her. The lady was incredibly touched, and she felt the love and care that the organization was sharing. It was a simple story that didn't need a full 2 to 3 minute video, but sharing it in the midst of the details of the outreach illustrated how people's lives were being impacted. The assumption was that this was just one of many individuals who were being impacted, so consider smaller stories that you can use to highlight the larger work that you're doing. So now that you've found some stories to tell, what are the elements that you need to consider in telling your story? When you're sharing a good story, you need to make sure you're actually telling a story. I realize that almost sounds stupid, but when you're just sharing a bunch of facts, then you're neglecting to tell an actual story. You need to make sure your story has a flow to it, following whatever your main character is throughout their journey. Speaking of which, you need a character to follow. This doesn't always need to be a specific individual. It could be a group of people. It could be the organization. The key is that you need to have some type of representative, or in this case character, that you're following through the story. Earlier I mentioned the food distribution story. In that story, the main characters were the people who were out of work and needing food, as well as the organization offering the care. The focus was on those being impacted, but we also followed the organization as they met this need. Meanwhile, the birthday lady was the main character of the mini story. The key is that these stories followed someone who was progressing through some type of life change, even if that change was a smaller one. It all illustrated the larger impact that the organization was having. Once you decide the story you're telling and what character you want to follow, you need to decide the point of view. You have the option of either following the point of view of the organization or the point of view of the person being impacted. What's this mean? Well, if you're telling the story of a specific individual impacted by your efforts, then you want to tell the story from their point of view and include them sharing the actual story, a testimonial. But if your story is more focusing on the overall impact the organization is having, then you might want to speak from the point of view of the organization and then include the other stories from that POV. Next week, we're going to be following along with an actual case study of storytelling, so this will all make more sense in that context. Either way, you need to figure out your POV. Finally, make sure you identify a conflict in your story. There are entire studies done on different forms of conflict you can have in a story, such as man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature, and so on. Regardless, in order to have a good story, you need to have a conflict. Discussing the story that I just keep bringing up, the conflict focused on how the pandemic meant people were unable to work, and as a result, they were falling short on food. So the conflict focused on the individuals needing food to survive. Pretty important. The story then told how the organization was helping people to overcome this conflict by providing them with the meals and supplies so they wouldn't go hungry. So now that you know the elements of a story, how do you bring it all together to actually tell a worthwhile story? There are countless ways to structure a story. If you ever watch an indie movie, they love to show the end of the story at the beginning, and then say something witty like, "You're probably wondering how I got here. Let me explain." Then they flash back to the beginning of the story and proceed to tell what happened. Or if you're Christopher Nolan, you tell everything out of order so that the viewer won't understand the story until it's over. Maybe not even that. More commonly though, you're going to find a chronological flow to a story. Beginning, middle, end. The heroes going about their day until suddenly they come across a conflict that they need to overcome. Then the story follows them as they wrestle with that conflict, until hopefully overcoming it in the end. I don't approach every video the same, but there are a set of questions that I like to consider when I'm telling a story. Where were you? Where are you now? And where are you going? I actually created a whole video diving into these ideas that you can see here, but I'm going to give a brief overview. First, where were you? So in the instance of the story of the food outreach, I want to see where they were before the organization helped them. In this case, they were out of work and needed food. You're helping to set up the conflict that they faced and why they needed the help in the first place. Next, where are you now? I like to explore the story of how they overcame the struggle. Most likely this was through whatever organization you're telling the story on behalf, so you're exploring how the support helped your main character to overcome. You're telling the story of that journey, ultimately ending where they are today. Finally, if you want to use this opportunity to vision cast for the future, you can explore the question, where are you going? This can be as simple as having your character talk about the hope that they've gotten, most likely illustrating how they have a renewed hope. Or if you're telling a story from the perspective of your organization, maybe you're dreaming about what a future expansion could look like and the larger impact you could have. This is a question that I don't always include in depth, but I like to add a hint of it into the closing section of the story. It really all depends on what's best for the goals of the story. I realize this approach can be very formulaic, so please don't take it as the only way to tell a story. It's simply a starting point. There are countless stories that I've shared where I haven't followed this at all. I ultimately want to make sure that I'm being faithful to whatever story I've had the honor of sharing, so don't think of this as the only approach. So that's the basics of finding and sharing stories. Great in theory, but what's it actually look like in practice? Great news! Next week we're going to be doing a case study with an organization I've actually worked with to explore how this plays out in the real world. If you haven't yet, make sure you like and subscribe, and answer the question for this week's entry into the contest. What's the question, you ask? I probably should tell you that. This week I want you to tell me what are the 3 questions that I like to ask anytime I tell a story. Answer that in the comments after you like and subscribe, and you'll be entered to win the Filmmaking Kit. Also, check out the links to Instagram and Facebook in the description and in our bio for your chance to win some sweet Smartphone Storytellers swag. September is for storytelling. So many ways to win. Either way though, remember it's ultimately not about the gear, it's about the story.